Hey, good evening, everyone. Come on in. Come on in, those of you in the hallways, and thank you for respecting our great Pawtucket Congregational Church here. We felt so great that they would allow us to use the facility, and of course, in respect to the good historic preservation work that they do, they'd like to not have the beer or the wine inside this part of the building. Outside there, it's fine. You may have noticed a for sale sign on the outside of the building, and that's because, what do you think? It's for sale. Unfortunately, the congregation is shrinking, so the city has put together a good group of people from all disciplines now that are going to begin thinking and caucusing on what could this building be for the city of Pawtucket. It probably will not be a house of worship any longer, but what can it add to what values can it add to the community that it's already added through the 100 or so years of its history. But it's we use it now for several different things, for conferencing, of course, for this, for performances. It's a wonderful performance space. It goes deep into the back of the building, so there's lots of little nooks and crannies. So there's a lot of thought, because Pawtucket now is a city that's really well, it's been involved in the arts for so many centuries, but it's now refound itself involved in the arts. And there's about, Mr. Weiss, how many studios are here? Over 300 artists are now working in the city. So maybe this becomes a part for that. But by way of an introduction, this is the Pawtucket Congregational Church. My name is Bob Billington. I'm the conference chair. And I am just trying to be as best as I can be and kind of duplicate an incredible moment in time that was March 2006, where a man named Dan Schilling coined this idea, civic tourism, and launched it on the universe, and we've been fascinated by it ever since. And you're going to hear from Dan. But so he organized this fabulous conference in Prescott, and Scott Russell Sanders was there, and Preserve America was there, and myself, I was there with my staff, and we became mesmerized by the conversations that were going on. And it was unlike a conference that we had ever been to before. I'm not sure we can mimic that and be as good as that, but we're going to try. And we talked to Dan a year or so ago and said, Dan, we've got to bring this conversation to the East Coast. It's so powerful, and we need to continue it. And Dan said, sure, let's do it. So we brought it to the East Coast. And so now it's been out in the West, and now it's here in the East, and it should plop itself in the middle of the country, I think. And maybe someone will raise their hand by the end of the conference and say, we ought to continue this conversation because it's valuable, and I hope that you all feel that way. Okay, it gives me just a few details about the space, of course. For those of you that haven't been here before, if you need the rest facilities, they're back through this door here, so just follow the hallway and you'll get there. And then, of course, exits. You can go through that exit there and back out through this way here in the case of some sort of an emergency. With that said, let me draw your attention to your conference pamphlet designed by Alex Summer on our staff. I'm quite proud of it. And take a look at that, because you'll see some of the background of the people that we've assembled to speak to us today. I'm sorry, this week. And we've got some terrific people. I mean, I'm so pleased and extremely honored, because we do this program that we started about 3 years ago called the Sustainable Tourism Planning and Development Laboratory. And that's the Blackstone Valley. And Blackstone Valley, from Worcester, Massachusetts, down here to Pawtucket, Rhode Island, has been a place of innovation. And what we think about the Blackstone is that this can continue to be a place of innovation, but innovation of tourism. And how can we make tourism relevant and important to the people that live here first? So the people that I think we really work for here are the 200,000 or so residents that make up the Blackstone Valley here in Rhode Island. Everybody after that comes second. Sorry, the visitor is number 3 on the list. Not that they're not important, but it's got to be a place first. For those of us that live here, for those of us that want to work here and develop their businesses, and if we get that right, people are going to flock here because they're going to think something is happening here. So that's the purpose of the Sustainable Tourism Planning and Development Lab. You all know in laboratories lots of mistakes are made. And we've been here for 23 years working on this project. And so we've made pretty much all of them. I suspect there are a lot more that we can make. But that goes along with trying to do anything successful. So look at your pamphlet. It's got some people here from, we've got two people that share something in common on the worldwide level. Kostas Chris is going to be here from the World Travel and Tourism Council. We also have Graham Miller. Graham is from the University of Surrey, but also works with the United Nations World Tourism Organization and the World Travel and Tourism Council. So we've got some great, spectacular talent. Just to name a few. Yesterday, I spent a little bit of time in Washington with National Geographic. They had a program, the Change Makers Conference, and it was basically they had a competition that went out around the world, and they were seeking people that were implementing geotourism, and was it successful? Wasn't it successful? How was it working? Had a great competition. 18 communities around the world emerged to the top, and yesterday they awarded three places from around the world change-making status. In other words, they were doing something great in geotourism. So go online to the National Geographic Society Center for Sustainable Destinations and check that out. But a couple of cool statements that I wrote down because I was so fascinated by these. And none of them were from Americans. These are from people that were North Americans or South Americans, or Latin Americans. They were from other parts of the world. And this is a great term that I thought was fascinating to me, that we ought to be developing tourism on our terms, not on their terms, whoever they are, but developing tourism on our terms and welcoming people on our terms. I think that basically says community first. That sounds just so much like civic tourism to me. Knowing when and how to engage the tourism community, I thought was another startling comment. Knowing when and how to engage the visitor, I think is critical, because simply, we all kind of think, of course you accept visitors. Just do it, put up the sign, advertise, promote. And that's not necessarily the case. One that I thought was another comment that come out of this session was that, and I don't know how this goes down with the males in the community, but I thought, there's some truth here and we've got to think this through. And it said, it's the mothers of society that hold the secret of sustainability due to their nurturing of space and place. The mothers of society, not the fathers of society. And I thought, wow, this is a guy saying this, by the way. But I thought that was profound, and it very well may be true. If you hang out in my office, which is mostly run by women, it is true. But anyway, without further delay, I just wanted to say thank you all for being here. I couldn't be more pleased. I respect so much the speakers that have come near and far, that we try to attract to the Sustainable Tourism Planning and Development Lab at least twice a year to come so we can learn, and we can learn in an environment that's formerly an industrialized landscape. You're sitting on the banks of the first polluted river in the hemisphere right out here. It's the first river to die in the hemisphere. It doesn't look so bad right now, but it was pretty much a mess. And what we're working here is how do we retrieve and regenerate this landscape? That's why I think civic tourism belongs here. So what I'd like to do, and that's why I think this conversation is so vital, not just to this community, but for the rest of the world to hear. Let me introduce you now to the I hate to call him the father of civic tourism, but he really is. He's the man who researched and spent most of his life. Nope, I'm not doing that yet. I'm already off schedule. I'm introducing you. Yes? That's what I wanted to do. Okay. Am I right? Am I okay? Okay, so now I'm going to introduce Mr. Lever, now that I've been reprimanded. Okay, since we've been working in the laboratory, what tends to work very well for us is to have a facilitator and a system and a pattern that has worked well is one that was developed by a company called New Commons in Providence, and the principal of New Commons, is with us today, and Mr. Levo I'm going to introduce. And he's going to speak to you essentially how we're going to engage and how we're going to make this conference work for you. Because if we all leave here with nothing other than a great time, I guess I'll be happy. But we have to leave here thinking the thoughts that we need to take into the future. And they got to be deep enough that they can resonate around this world for those of you that are joining us. And we have people here from Kenya and Alberta, in Tokyo, and I'm forgetting Switzerland and other places. But let me introduce you to our facilitator and the man I'm making very nervous because I'm going on a little bit too long, and he's our timekeeper, Mr. Robert Lever.
But I'm used to it. Thank you. Hey, Bob. Can you pass those out? Get some folks. I'm going to take about 5 minutes to cue this up a little bit, just to give you a couple of images of what we're trying to create here over the next 4 days. New Englanders created something called the Commons. It was the land that everyone owned in common. Cows grazed there. Early town meetings before town halls were held there. And notices got posted there. So part of what New Commons is about, and not New Commons capital N, capital C, but small n, small c, is this idea of creating ways in which people can come together. And that's what this conference is all about. There are talks, there are workshops, but that's not the story. The real story is about how you get new thinking, new linking, and new doing among you. How do you figure out what he's about? How do you figure out what he's about? What idea does he have that's going to be useful to you? What connections do you have that are going to be helpful to Natalie back there? You get the idea. So we're really trying to create this new commons in the next 4 days. And to do it as a learning community, which basically means, although Dan's going to have some words and Scott's going to have some words, it's about everyone teaching and everyone learning. That's the essence of a learning community. Everyone teaching, everyone learning. And on the back of the the front part of that sheet, you'll see some other ways to engage. In other words, let me tell you a story. 4 years ago, I was part of a conference called Transforming Urban Communities, which was a comparison of the Renaissance of Providence, Rhode Island, and Liverpool, England. And a bunch of us decided we didn't want conventional programming, where the workshop person stands up, lays out the problem, and presents the solution, and everyone goes home. In fact, we said, leave your solutions at home. There were no workshops. There were conversations. There were roundtables. It was all about engaging in questions, images, ideas, dilemmas, practice. So what we're trying to get you to think about when you pose a question to Scott later, pose a question, not a solution. Give him an idea to play with. I'm thinking about this. What do you think about it? Which leads me to my last point. Instead of doing the traditional Q&A, we're going to have a conversation. But what we're going to do is we're going to create little immediate groups in the room of 3s and 4s. And your objective is going to come up with something collectively that you want to pose for conversation, not just to these two guys, but to this whole community. They're the catalyst, but everybody in this room is contributing to this conversation. Now, one poem. There is a channel between voice and presence, a way where information flows. In disciplined silence, the channel opens. With wandering talk, it closes. So that's from Rumi, 12th century. He was on to something back then. And that's really what the essence of this conversation is about, is listening, staying in the silence, and really trying to put something forward that can move the conversation forward towards civic tourism. Bob? It's an improvisation. Right, Bob?
Thank you, Bob. I had one other note someplace here. it was to do with the buses. All check those of you staying at hotels, please check your schedules inside of your bag. It will tell you what time the bus will arrive there tomorrow. We're going to be on our way up to Woonsocket, up to the northern part of Rhode Island. We're going to be meeting in a 20th century or 1920s theater, taking over Main Street, and then we're going to bring you to this incredible space called the St. Anne's Arts and Cultural Center, which is all done in frescoes. It looks like a Roman cathedral. It's quite wonderful. Natalie, what was the other piece I wanted to remind them of? Yes, those of you departing tonight to a hotel, we'll get you back. Also to, I guess that was it. And then Friday morning, anyone that's coming in separate, not staying at a hotel, if you arrive at the Comfort Inn by 7:30 in the morning, you can board your bus there for one of the 5 laboratories. And we're going to be in Mystic, Connecticut, of course, Providence, South County, Newport, and Cape Cod. Fascinating works. Yeah, good. So without further delay, let me introduce you to Dr. Dan Schilling. Many years with the humanities community in Arizona, and I'm just so thankful that he chose a topic that he's very, very interested in, and that is tourism, because I think we are all benefiting from that. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Dan Schilling.
Thanks, Bob. I'm going to be very brief because I want to hear from Scott, not me. But just a few comments. First of all, thanks to Bob and to Natalie and to Lily and the people who have been holding our hands here the last couple months. And let me just say one thing about civic tourism, how I got interested in it. I love to travel, and I think a lot of us love to travel. And as tourism professionals, what we do every day is that we get to share our home with strangers. What a great opportunity. Well, it's something we should take pride in. So on the one hand, as travelers, there's this wonderful experience. And as tourism professionals, there's this wonderful experience. So why isn't it always wonderful? That's really the premise of civic tourism, is it can be and it should be something that we take pride in. And then how then do we use the industry to help us preserve the very things we love and cherish about our place? And you can hear more from me if you want to. There's a workshop on Civic Tourism 101, I think tomorrow. You can read the book, you can go to the website. But I really want to get around to my introduction here. You can read about Scott in the program that he's the Distinguished Professor of English at Indiana University. He's written more than 20 books, I think, all of them that I know I've read. But I want to introduce Scott Sanders, my friend. I first stumbled onto, hi Tim, a fellow Arizonan. I first stumbled onto Scott in 1993 when I was working at the Humanities Council, and a friend of mine said, you should read this book called Staying Put. I went out and read the book, and I was just blown away, because at the time in Arizona we were doing a lot of work on sense of place, building communities, what creates healthy places, and I read this book and I said, here's a man who understands what we're about and loves place, cherishes place, loves people, and has this amazing ability to express it in books like nobody I've ever seen. So I just called him up and I said, we're doing some work in Arizona, would you come out and give a talk at one of our conferences? Well, not only did he do that, but we drove to Bisbee together. We went hiking together. I'm, by the way, immortalized in one of his books called Hunting for Hope. And I thank you, Scott, for not naming me, because I got us lost. We were out hiking. So I show up in the book as my hiking buddy. But he has continued to write and speak very eloquently about this whole notion of sense of place and community. So we had worked on that project together. A book came out of that that Scott contributed to on building healthy communities. And then when I got into the tourism world in the late 80s, And in Arizona, in the West, tourism is all about place. You know, we don't have many theme parks there. It is about the community. It is about natural places, built places. And we started working on this thing called Civic Tourism, and I asked Scott to keynote the conference in 2006 that Bob referred to. And his talk was amazing, and it was so good that I asked Scott when I wrote the book on civic tourism, I asked him if I could use his talk for the forward. So when you read the book, you're reading the talk that he gave in Prescott in 2006. Scott's also working with me next year. If any of you are college faculty, we're doing a month-long institute next year in Prescott on Aldo Leopold, the ecologist, sustainability. So look for that online, and Scott's one of the 5 great faculty people we have coming to teach that talk. So without further ado, as they say, let me introduce you to my friend, Scott Russell Sanders.
I had the choice, can you hear all right in the back? I had the choice between here and up there. And although there was a time when my mother wanted me to be up there, I chose to become a teacher instead. Those of you who were at the first Civic Tourism Conference in Prescott in March of '06, if you remember anything at all about my talk, probably remember that I had a severe eye infection. And I literally struggled to read. And I think whatever good comments people had about the talk may have been due to their sympathy for my eye infection. I see just fine now. I want to assure you of that. So this is called Traveling at Home, and you'll see at the end of the talk, it's a written talk. I'm a writer, not an extemporizer. You'll see at the end of the talk that title comes from a well-known passage in Thoreau's Walden, where he says, I have traveled much in Concord, his hometown in Concord, Massachusetts. And I've been thinking a long time about traveling where we live, or traveling close to where we live, and that's what lies behind this title. So some of you heard me give the talk called The Geography of Somewhere in Prescott that Dan referred to, and some of you may have read it online. Some of you may have read it as the introduction of Dan's book on civic tourism. And at the risk of repeating myself, I want to reiterate just a few of the main points of that talk, because I want to build on that in the rest of what I'm going to say. I raised some eyebrows in Prescott. I'm not a tourism scholar. I'm not in any way related to the tourism industry. I'm very much an outsider, but I am somebody who cares a lot about and has thought a certain amount about place and what it is about place that speaks to us and why it matters, why a sense of place matters to us as individuals and why it matters tremendously to our communities. Well, I raised some eyebrows in Prescott when I said the following: Americans gad about too much. Our ceaseless mobility burns up the Earth's dwindling supply of petroleum, destabilizes the climate, enslaves us to tyrannical regimes in the Middle East, embroils us in war, buries more and more of our landscape under pavement, and shatters our communities. No person, I said, concerned about the fate of our planet and the welfare of our descendants should encourage any more idle movement. The kind of travel we call tourism is too often only another version of shopping, treating the whole country as a gigantic mall, offering trinkets and distractions for sale. Too often, tourism is driven by a yen for golfing or gambling, a craving for novelty or scenery, or by simple boredom. If we are going to rove about the continent, burning up oil and jeopardizing our grandchildren's future, we ought to be moved by larger motives. I went on to say that I thought these larger motives might be what they might be by comparing travel at its best to a kind of vision quest, in which we journey away from the familiar world to encounter some alien setting, some natural or cultural or spiritual presence that enlarges our understanding, and then we journey home to act out that larger vision in our households, neighborhoods, towns, and cities. And as in a mythic quest, what begins as a private search ends up enhancing the life of the tribe. I suggested in Prescott that the traveler's understanding is most enriched through an encounter with a distinctive, coherent, powerful sense of place. A place that defies the homogenizing influences of box stores, strip malls, franchises, cookie-cutter suburbs, tyrannical highways, and vapid mass media. Then I outlined some of the qualities that give certain places a feeling of character and charisma, making them worthy of a visitor's deep engagement and of a citizen's love. Here's an abbreviated list of some of those qualities. A real place feels as though it belongs where it is, as though it has grown there, shaped by weather and geography rather than being imported from somewhere else and set down arbitrarily like a mail-order kit. The connection to geography may show up in building materials, in foods, in voices, as well as in architecture and music. A real place, a place worth visiting, is distinguished by a vigorous local economy, one that draws on resources from the region and from the skills and knowledge of its own citizens. Key enterprises, from factories to coffee shops, reflect the taste and judgment of local people, the people who actually own them, rather than the dictates of distant corporations. Dollars spent in such a community circulate there for a spell instead of being immediately whisked away to some distant, remote headquarters. Visitors know they have arrived in a cherished place when artists choose not merely to live there, like the 300 studios here in Pawtucket, not merely to live there, but to photograph and paint it, to write and sing about it. When archaeologists and historians delve into its past, when naturalists keep track of the local flora and fauna, and when elders pass on all of this knowledge to the young. A real place conveys a sense of temporal depth, a sense that people have been living here and laboring here for a long time. The traces of earlier generations are preserved in festivals and folk ways and habits of speech, in old buildings that have been restored and kept in service, in landscapes that are still devoted to traditional uses such as orchards, dairies, and woodlots. Such a place is alive and changing like any organism, gaining and losing residents, tearing down and building up, yet there is continuity amid the change. The presence of history, good and bad, not only enriches our experience of a place, it also reminds us that we who are alive now suffer as well as benefit from the actions of our ancestors, and that our actions, in turn, will affect those who come after us. A real place keeps us mindful of nature, as it keeps us mindful of history. In the built environment, one feels the presence of the living environment. In parks, gardens, bike and pedestrian trails, river corridors, beaches, urban forests, and yards given over to native plants, and in all the creatures from crows to coyotes that share the place with our two-legged kind. Just as we relish the presence of nature, so in real places we delight in the company of other people. A vital community provides many public gathering spots, from auditoriums and farmers markets and cafes to playgrounds and plazas and parks, where people are free to mix with neighbors and strangers. The more diverse the mixture, the more illuminating the experience is likely to be. In a truly democratic gathering space, people from all walks of life may argue and swap stories and admire one another's babies and sympathize with one another's aches, all the while feeling at home. The true wealth of a community shows up not in the grandeur of private residences or fancy stores, but in the quality of libraries, schools, museums, parks, courthouses, galleries, and other public arenas. Alluring places invite us to immerse ourselves, to open all our senses. We encounter such places not by gazing through windshields or by gaping at screens, but by walking or paddling or bicycling. Sidewalks become more important than streets. Parks become more important than parking lots. Legs more important than wheels. On foot, we experience the world in 3 dimensions. We move at a speed that allows us to absorb and savor and reflect. I could have described a good many other qualities that distinguish real places from phony ones. But with this sampling, I hope to suggest why cities and towns endowed with a rich, deep, coherent sense of place attract visitors, and why these visitors might be inspired to nurture similar qualities back home. I concluded my talk in Prescott by saying that the sort of tourism we ought to encourage would show us how people richly inhabit a place, how they cooperate, make decisions, solve problems, enjoy one another's company, and look after their home ground. Such tourism would renew our appreciation for the security that arises from neighborliness and mutual aid. It would encourage us to think about our cities, towns, and countrysides as arenas for our common life and not merely as patchworks of private property. It would remind us that we are responsible for the care of our communities, for the health of the land, and for one another. In short, such tourism would educate us to become better citizens, first of our neighborhoods and ultimately of our nation and planet. In my Prescott talk, I never used the word sustainable. But in outlining my vision of civic tourism, I was describing the only form of tourism that seems likely to be sustainable. To call any kind of tourism sustainable means that we can reasonably imagine continuing it far into the future without degrading the quality of life in the place being visited, without exhausting the visitor's interest, and without damaging the earth. How far into the future should we try to imagine? Businesses often look to the next fiscal year, or merely to the next quarter. Politicians often look to the next election or the next press conference. Households often look to the next paycheck. Addicts of all sorts, from alcoholics to recreational shoppers, often look only to the next fix. By contrast with this short-term thinking, the Iroquois people of upstate New York instruct their leaders to look 7 generations into the future when making decisions. Although I admire this instruction, I don't pretend to be able to see 7 generations ahead. But since I have 3 granddaughters, the oldest of them just beginning kindergarten and the youngest of them 8 months old, I try to imagine the span of their lifetimes, which, if they are blessed with good health and a stable and wholesome society, should last through the rest of this century. So if we try to envision a form of tourism that might be sustainable for the next century, what large trends must we bear in mind? The trends that seem most significant to me, not merely for the future of tourism, but for all human activities, are the end of cheap oil, the decline in the standard of living of most Americans, and the degradation of the earth as a home for life, especially the disturbance of the global climate. I will say a few words about each item on my list, but first let me emphasize that I do not welcome these gloomy predictions, nor do I speak about them as any sort of expert. I have merely read the arguments of people who are experts, and I am convinced that any thoughtful vision of our future must grapple with the conditions I am sketching here. So the first of these trends is the depletion of the world's supply of oil and natural gas, even as demand for fossil fuel relentlessly rises. Experts disagree about exactly when the production of oil and gas from existing or newly discovered fields will reach a maximum and then begin to decline. Some say this moment of so-called peak oil has already occurred. Others say it will occur within the next few decades. But all agree that the decline in production is inevitable within this century, as the world's existing fields are being drained much more rapidly than new fields are being discovered. In fact, the peak for global discovery of new deposits of oil and natural gas occurred in the 1960s. And since the 1960s, the annual discovery of new deposits has ranged between 10% and 50% of the amount we are burning up every year. The decline in supply will coincide with the increasing clamor from oil from rapidly industrializing economies in Asia and South America. Moreover, the remaining oil will be much more expensive to extract, ship, and refine than the more easily accessible deposits that we have already burned. The result of these trends will be an inexorable rise in the cost of oil and gas and of everything made from or powered by oil or gas. While the prices of gasoline, diesel fuel, jet fuel, heating oil, plastics, artificial fertilizers, pharmaceuticals, and other petroleum byproducts will oscillate up and down with the vicissitudes of the marketplace, they will do so on an upward trending line. Since our entire economy, indeed the global economy, is built on cheap energy, this rise in the price of petroleum-based fuels and materials will affect every aspect of our lives. The kinds of work we do, how we travel, how we heat and cool our homes, where we get our food, how we entertain ourselves. What are the implications for tourism? Air travel will increasingly become a luxury, as will long-distance travel by private automobile. So-called recreational vehicles will disappear from the roads. As a result, destinations such as Disney World and Las Vegas, and enterprises such as cruise lines that depend on a vast flow of visitors traveling from far away will begin to wither. International travel will diminish, and sites dependent on large numbers of foreign visitors will suffer accordingly. At the same time, destinations close to major population centers may benefit. Like much else in our lives, tourism will become more local. Instead of driving or flying across the country to national parks or resorts, more people will visit state parks and cultural centers in their home region. Instead of taking bus tours of Europe, more Americans will seek out comparably vibrant settlements and landscapes in our own country. Travelers will take shorter trips with fewer jumps from place to place, and perhaps with longer stays in these nearby destinations. They will be drawn to communities that are designed for walkers or bicyclists rather than drivers, and that offer high-quality public transportation, such as light rail and electric trolleys. They will also be drawn to communities that are conveniently accessible by passenger railroad service, which is by far the most fuel-efficient mode of transporting people. In response to higher gasoline prices, Americans have already reduced their driving. Between November of last year and August of this year, Americans drove 50 billion fewer miles than they had during the comparable period of the year before. During the entire 1970s, with the Arab oil boycott, the reduction in driving was on the order of 48 billion miles. And in 8 months, Americans reduced their driving by that amount. This reduction in driving, coupled with a shift towards smaller vehicles, has led to a dramatic drop in revenue from the federal gasoline tax and to a serious shortfall in the Highway Trust Fund. Congress, just a few weeks ago, voted to appropriate $9 billion from the general fund to cover this deficit, thereby adding to the national debt without addressing the underlying problem. The problem is that our road system is overbuilt and under-maintained. The interstate highway system is likely to deteriorate further, making driving more hazardous as well as more damaging to cars and trucks. If the gas tax is increased significantly in an effort to fund proper maintenance, drivers will cut back even more on their mileage, thus continuing a downward spiral in tax revenues. If we are going to draw on general funds to subsidize transportation, it would be far more economical and environmentally sound to refurbish and expand the passenger rail system, which was once the best in the world and is now the worst among industrialized nations. The rise in the price of oil and natural gas will likewise undermine industrial agriculture, which relies on cheap energy for the manufacture of fertilizer, which is made from natural gas, pesticides, herbicides for the processing, shipping, and storage of crops, for irrigation, and for the operation of its gigantic machinery. Over the next century, agriculture will revert to the practices that were common around the world before the cheap oil binge. It will be smaller in scale, less dependent on chemical inputs, more reliant on human labor and skill and on animal power, more respectful of the health of soils and waters, and it will serve a primarily local market. Similarly, global franchises that sell cheap goods made in low-wage countries 12,000 miles away will gradually collapse as the cost of manufacturing and shipping escalates. Local industries and crafts and retail stores will begin to recover, and they will be more responsive to the tastes and needs of their communities. Interchangeable malls on the outskirts of town will shrivel, and distinctive main streets will rebound. Again, the implications for tourism are clear. Destinations that rely on importing industrially produced food and goods from great distances will suffer, while towns and cities and regions that support a robust local agriculture and manufacturing base will thrive. Visitors will be attracted to cities and towns that demonstrate how we can wean ourselves from fossil fuel by emphasizing conservation and compact development, by embracing green building codes, by sponsoring municipal wind farms or photoelectric farms, by facilitating car sharing and bicycle commuting, Such visionary communities will appeal to visitors by providing glimpses of a viable future. The second large trend that will affect the future of tourism is the decline in real income for most Americans and the increasing burden of debt carried by individuals, households, and our nation as a whole. Except for the highest income brackets in our country, real earnings in constant dollars, adjusted for inflation, have been stagnant or decreasing for the past 30 years. Virtually all of the benefit from the rising worker productivity since the advent of computers has gone to those highest income brackets. Increases in household income during this period have been due almost entirely to the increase in the number of hours worked and the entry of more women into the workplace. In most households, there are no more available workers and no more hours available for working. As the cost of basic necessities from housing to health care has increased while hourly wages have stagnated or declined, most Americans have had less and less money left over for discretionary spending. Our net household savings rate in this country has been declining steadily and is now close to zero. By comparison, the household savings rate in France is 12%. In Germany, it's 11%. In the United States, 10 years ago, it was 6%. It is now virtually 0%. We have maintained our inflated rate of consumption mainly through borrowing on credit cards, on home equity loans, and on tax cuts that have inflated the national debt. Tax cuts that are not funded or replaced by spending cuts are simply another form of borrowing from the future. The average American household now carries $9,000 in credit card debt. Adding in car loans, mortgages, and other forms of credit, the average household now owns a record 134% of its disposable income, nearly double the figure from a generation ago. The total household debt in America is now greater than the gross national product. Over the past decade, as families have maxed out their credit cards, millions of Americans financed major purchases, medical bills, and even monthly expenses by borrowing against the equity in their homes. Now that house prices are sinking, that source of credit has dried up, and millions of people owe more money on their houses than their houses are worth. The result has been a record number of foreclosures and personal bankruptcies. Even after the current housing bubble collapses and recovery begins, the rising cost of energy will make the far-flung suburbs and bloated McMansions even less attractive and will further depreciate their value. As a nation, through federal spending, we have also been living far beyond our means. When Ronald Reagan took office in 1980, the national debt stood at just under $1 trillion. When he left office, the figure had tripled to nearly $3 trillion, mainly through a combination of tax cuts and increased military spending. Bill Clinton's administration began with a debt of over $4 trillion and ended with a debt of over $5 trillion. During the second Bush administration, the debt has so far doubled to nearly $11 trillion, again primarily due to tax cuts and military spending. This amounts to a debt of $34,000 for every man, woman, and child in America. So every child born today inherits a debt of $34,000. To fund the current Wall Street bailout, Congress has just raised the debt ceiling to $11.3 trillion, and they will raise it again within 12 months for certain. Some of this debt is owed to American citizens, but an increasing proportion of it, over a quarter, is now owed to foreign investors. And our continuing our continued borrowing depends on a steady flow of money from abroad. In 2006, for the first time in half a century, more money flowed out of America to pay foreign investors than flowed into America from our investments abroad. From being the world's largest net investor, the United States has now become the world's largest net debtor. We have not incurred this debt in order to invest in research, new technologies, manufacturing facilities, infrastructure improvement, education, or other sources of future wealth. We have incurred this debt primarily to fund wars and current consumption. Our federal government is currently borrowing more than $3 billion a day, more than $1 trillion a year. We have not paid for the savings and loan debacle of the 1980s. We have not paid for the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. We have not paid for the recent bailouts of banks and Wall Street firms and Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and AIG. We have merely put these enormous expenditures on the public charge card and have passed along the burden to future taxpayers, including our children and grandchildren. As a nation, we are strapped. Meanwhile, the rapid rise in private indebtedness, foreclosures, job losses, and bankruptcies has forced most Americans to cut back on discretionary spending. Optimists will claim that this is a temporary setback, that the American economy will soon come roaring to life, that the debt will somehow evaporate, and that once again we will become a nation of free spenders. I am more persuaded by the pessimists, or what I would call the realists, who argue that we are in for a long-term decline in real income and real spending. According to this view, the decline will be driven not only by mounting debt, but also by the transfer of American businesses and real estate to foreign ownership, by the decades-long neglect of our nation's infrastructure, from bridges to sewage systems, by the deterioration of our schools and the consequent deterioration of our workforce, by the loss of our manufacturing base, by the distortion of our economy through military spending. We now account for 51% of the world's military spending, the United States of America. 4.8% of the world's population, 51% of the world's military spending. And also, we will be suffering the effects of the increasing disparities between the very, very rich and everybody else. And all of these factors are in addition to our nation's delay in reducing our dependence on oil, in developing renewable sources of energy, and in addressing serious environmental challenges, especially global warming. If we are indeed headed toward a long-term decline in living standards, again, the implications for tourism are clear. The wealthiest Americans will still frequent luxury destinations, of course, but I am not interested in tourism that is available only to the rich. For the foreseeable future, most Americans are simply going to have less money to spend on transportation, hotels, restaurant meals, entrance fees, or travel-related shopping. The most attractive destinations will require short trips, including journeys by railroad or streetcar or bus. They will offer abundant public spaces, such as plazas and open-air markets and parks where admission is free, as well as museums and historic buildings where the admission charge is modest. They will offer inexpensive accommodations and meals that carry the flavor of the place, bed and breakfast or historic hotels, for example, rather than chain motels, and local restaurants serving local produce rather than generic fast food serving industrial produce. These destinations, these favored destinations, will be inviting to walkers because the streets are clean and safe and old neighborhoods are intact. The downtown is filled with intriguing shops, and the citizens of the place enjoy a convivial life. The third large trend that will affect the future of tourism is the degradation of the environment, both locally and globally. Some of the effects are obvious. The pollution of rivers, lakes, and beaches will discourage visitors, as will air pollution. Some effects are less obvious. For example, the necessity of imposing fees for the release of carbon into the atmosphere will drive up the cost of energy, and therefore of nearly everything else. Similarly, the erosion and poisoning of topsoil due to industrial farming will drive up the cost of food. The proliferation of toxins in the soil, water, and air will increase our healthcare expenditures, which are already by far the highest per capita in the world. Population growth, augmented by immigration, will place greater pressure on our land, natural resources, public facilities, and fellow species. But the most serious effect of environmental degradation, not merely on tourism, but on the habitability of the planet, will result from the destabilizing of Earth's climate. I speak of destabilizing or disturbance rather than global warming or climate change, because the latter terms do not convey the dire nature of the predictions. There is a nearly unanimous consensus among scientists that the atmospheric heating already underway will lead to greater and greater extremes of weather. Longer droughts, fiercer heat waves, more frequent flooding, more violent storms, and possibly to major shifts in ocean currents. The evidence so far supports these predictions. Record high temperatures, increased number and intensity of hurricanes, the melting of ice caps and glaciers and permafrost, the drying up of rivers, the rising of sea levels, the movement of species to higher altitudes. The spread of epidemic disease and invasive species brought on by atmospheric warming has already added to our healthcare costs, depleted our fisheries, and devastated our forests. The annual cost of damage from storms, tornadoes, and flooding has risen into the tens of billions of dollars. There is an equally broad consensus among scientists that the release of greenhouse gases from human activity is a major contributor to this atmospheric heating. With just under 5% of the world's population, the United States produces roughly 25% of those emissions. Yet so far, as a nation, we have failed to address this looming catastrophe in any meaningful way. There have been piecemeal responses by individuals and businesses and municipalities and even by a few states, but there have been no comprehensive measures to radically reduce our carbon impact or to prepare for the likely consequences of climate destabilization. Meanwhile, there has been no serious effort at reducing greenhouse emissions in the world's rapidly industrializing nations, such as China and India. And even in nations such as those in the European Union, which have shown a higher degree of concern, there has been no significant reduction in emissions. So it seems inevitable that the atmosphere will continue heating and that weather and climate will depart more and more from the patterns within which our urban industrial civilization has developed. No one can be sure how any given place will fare, but the overall effect on our economy and our quality of life will certainly be serious and harmful. As conditions deteriorate, tourism is likely to be seen by many people as a luxury, both because of tight finances and because of rising concerns about the ecological costs of travel. Like the other large trends I have mentioned, this one suggests that the forms of tourism most likely to endure will be more local, more reliant on public transportation, more focused on experiences of place than on recreational shopping. Individual towns and cities cannot solve global environmental problems on their own, of course, but they can lobby for state and federal policies that boldly address these problems. They can contribute to the collective effort through practices I have already mentioned. such as the fostering of local agriculture and renewable energy sources, or through the use of living roofs on municipal buildings and solar-powered streetcars and green building design or retrofitting. Travelers will be drawn to communities that take good care of their home ground, where the air and water are clean, green space is abundant, trees line the streets, yards and parks are burgeoning with plants and butterflies and birds. Indeed, the more our environment as a whole deteriorates, the more attractive such green places will become. What I have been arguing here is that tourism can flourish over the next century only in communities that are ecologically sustainable. And our communities can flourish only in proportion as we move individually and collectively toward a more local, smaller scale, less violent, less consumptive way of life. If the human economy is to endure, it must align itself with the greater economy of nature. Anyone concerned about the long-term viability of tourism should therefore support efforts at shifting from an industrial growth economy to a steady state economy grounded in ecology and conservation. Such a shift will require the development of energy derived from sun and wind and other renewable resources, the renewal of railroads and other systems of public transportation, the revival of locally owned enterprises, the fostering of local foods and arts and other aspects of regional culture, the recovery of genuinely local news media, the protection of green spaces and wild lands, the enhancement of common goods such as parks and schools, the preservation of topsoil and clean water and breathable air, and the careful stewardship of non-renewable resources such as oil. Moving toward a sustainable society will also require a shift in consciousness. We will need to stop measuring wealth by the empty numbers traded on financial markets and begin measuring the true sources of wealth in the condition of Earth's living systems, in human knowledge and skill, in productive enterprises, in the well-being of our communities, and in the real assets, both public and private, that actually contribute to our well-being. We will need to give up thinking of ourselves as free-floating individuals empowered by money. We will need to reimagine our lives as woven into human and natural communities, dependent for our well-being on the goods we share, from watersheds to scientific research, from the transportation system to the judicial system, from language to libraries. We will need to identify ourselves as conservers rather than consumers, as stewards of the Earth's bounty rather than exploiters. We will need to see that the construction and maintenance of a vast military complex and the fighting of perpetual wars is a grotesque waste of human and natural wealth and a distraction from our real challenges. The challenges we face are not primarily military, despite the ceaseless talk of terrorists and enemies. Our greatest challenges are ecological and social. The challenge of feeding ourselves healthy food, preserving adequate supplies of fresh water, defending ourselves from epidemic diseases, providing quality health care for all citizens, reducing our levels of mental illness and crime and incarceration, renewing our schools, developing alternatives to cheap fossil fuels, reducing our greenhouse emissions, rebuilding our nation's decrepit infrastructure, recovering a sense of the common good. These are what is essential to our security. The values necessary for meeting these challenges are out of fashion now, but they run deep in the American tradition. Among them are prudence, generosity, simplicity, humility, thrift, compassion, forbearance, honesty, civic-mindedness, and concern for future generations. Communities that are best able to embody these values and face these challenges will be the most attractive places to visit, as well as the most humane places to live. All of this may be wishful thinking on my part, of course. Americans may keep on driving the interstates and crowding the airports and traveling to resorts and casinos until the oil runs out and foreclosure signs go up in half our front yards. But I have more faith in my fellow citizens than that. I am betting that more and more of us will wake up to our predicament, reconsider our behavior, and begin acting more conservingly and responsibly in all aspects of our lives, including in the way we travel. If I overestimate our capacity for thoughtful change, and if we continue to consume and spend and mine and pave as recklessly as we have done for the past century, then the coming century will be grim indeed, and the fate of tourism will be the least of our concerns. But I refuse to accept that dismal prospect. I won't surrender to such a future for my 3 young granddaughters or for anyone's children or grandchildren. No doubt some people will keep gadding about in search of thrills, amusement rides, floor shows, slot machines, golf links, and auto races as long as they can afford to do so. But I believe that such distractions will come to be seen as wasteful and vacuous. As the cumulative effects of rising energy costs, personal and public debt, and environmental stress take hold, many Americans, I predict, will hunger for something more substantial from their journeys. They will travel less for recreation than for illumination. In seeking visions of a desirable future, they will be drawn to places that demonstrate more wholesome and ecologically sound ways of living. Henry David Thoreau wrote in Walden, "I have traveled a good deal in Concord." Readers have taken this to mean that he chose to explore his hometown and the surrounding countryside rather than jaunt to more glamorous locales. No doubt that is part of what he meant. And we would all do well to pay closer attention to our neighborhoods. But Thoreau also ventured further afield, leaving records of his excursions up the Concord and Merrimack rivers, as well as to Maine, Cape Cod, Long Island, and other destinations. So when he remarked, "I have traveled much in Concord," I think he also meant that all of his journeys, near or far, deepened his understanding and affection for his home place, and thereby made him a better citizen of Concord. We would do well to bring the fruits of our own travels back to enrich the places from which we set out. Our travels affect more than our home places and the places we visit. Every journey sends ripples of influence around the planet and into the future. Whether those influences are, on the whole, benign or destructive depends on how and why we travel and on what we do with the knowledge we have gained. Because Earth is our only dwelling place, no matter where we go on our journeys, we are always traveling at home. Thank you.
So, the idea now is to find 3 or 4 folks to have a chat with. And your assignment is a simple one. Take a look at the first sheet of that handout we just talked about. See if you can find a question, an image, an idea, a practice, a dilemma, maybe the wild card, maybe something integrative. And come to an agreement about something you'd like to pose to Scott for the community conversation. You have 3 minutes. 3 minutes. Groups of 3s and 4s to come up with something. You have to find a group, all you solo folks. All right, folks. Here's how it's going to work. I have 2 microphones. One for me, one for who I pass to. Now, Scott and Dan are going to be responding. But I want this to get beyond Q&A. Question, answer, have a conversation with them. So it's a back and forth for a while. We have about 40 minutes before the band starts. The sandwiches are out there. There's drink out there, but you can't drink in here. So you're going to have to kind of straddle the doorway to have a glass of wine or beer and listen to the music. Who'd like to go first? Who'd like to go first? Up.
A fellow Hoosier. I'm Brenda Myers from Hamilton County, Indiana. And my son's taking English this semester, so I want him down at IU, and I want him to get a really good grade. So if you could work on that, that'd be really good. Thanks. 100+ years ago, the National Academy of Sciences predicted a shortage of horses. A lot of gloom and doom was predicted today, and we want you to tell us how we as tourism and attractions and community professionals can be a part of a positive solution so that tourism is around for years to come.
You should keep that in case you want to comment back, okay?
Well, I said at the beginning that I'm aware that the 3 big trends that I talked about, essentially oil, environment, and economy, were dismal. And I don't relish the gloom. I don't revel in it. I regret it, partly because I have lived through a time of excess in America, and I have enjoyed luxuries that our descendants are not going to be able to enjoy, and I regret that. So I don't say things about limitations with a sense of glee or pleasure. On the contrary, I do think that humans are curious, humans are restless, humans are going to continue to travel. They're going to continue to travel for a lot of different reasons. I was really talking about the forms of travel that seem to me to be sustainable. I don't think that gambling destinations in the middle of a desert that are pumping water out of aquifers below the ground are sustainable. I don't think Las Vegas is going to be there in 50 years. There'll be something there, but it's not going to be what we think of as Las Vegas. And I really do think that the Disney enterprises and the other big, huge theme park kind of enterprises are going to wither. They already failed in Europe. I do think that there are forms of local and nearby tourism that are going to flourish because of that curiosity and the energy and the drive to explore things is not going to go away in us. It shouldn't go away in us, but it's going to be redirected. So instead of getting on a plane and flying 2,000 or 3,000 miles to go to a national park, I think people are much more likely to take whatever means of transport is available, which might be an electric-powered private car, or it might be passenger train service, and go to someplace nearby and have analogous experiences with less grandeur, perhaps, but with perhaps a deeper appreciation of where they are. So I don't see it as negative. I'm talking about this vision. I think it's realistic. And I think any vision of the long-term future that doesn't recognize the consequences of these major changes is wishful thinking.
Comment back? Yeah, please.
Just a comment.
Please.
Maybe it's my age, but I feel like every advantage is temporary. France 100 years ago was complaining about the same issues US is complaining now. Every product has a life cycle. Maybe the United States won't travel to Europe, but maybe Africa will come to travel to Europe, or Europe will go to travel to Australia. So I think it's just a shift in the market. And as long as we pay attention not to make the same mistakes over and over again, I really don't think that with the rate of innovation we are going these days, we're going to go that low. But this is just a comment.
Nervous? Why?
Yeah, just looking.
I like that you stood up.
Hi, I'm Colleen Mayo, and these are my friends. We are currently all students in the hospitality industry at Johnson & Wales University in Providence, from travel majors to hotels. Obviously, the fuel costs and concerns are a big concern for us where we're upcoming in the travel industry. Do you have any suggestions of maybe fields that we should look into more than others? Like, instead of running bus tours, should we be looking more into working in national parks or things like that?
Well, take any advice I give about careers with a lot of salt. Not just a grain, but many, and I think Dan may have more useful things to say than I do. What I always say, I work with young people all the time, college age and graduate student age students all the time. And what I always say is you need to figure out what you love, and then figure out how to get paid to do what you love, or some part of what you love. And not everybody, most people in fact don't manage to do that. Most people end up in work that isn't very close to what they love, but they need the money to survive. So that's my sort of fundamental. So if you love the idea of working in hospitality, then stay with it. Don't abandon it because it looks like it might be a difficult career, but figure out what forms of hospitality are most likely to endure. I think, frankly, that the future of bed and breakfast is much brighter than the future of Hilton hotels or other comparable chains. Hotels are not going to go away, but I think they're going to become a more and more precarious industry. Just as, things expand to a certain point, we have this notion that things should grow perpetually. So because Starbucks, for example, as a corporation, grew and grew and grew and grew, there was this notion somehow that it would always grow. But nothing grows forever. Hotel chains don't grow forever. Tourism, number of bodies coming through a town doesn't grow forever. Starbucks didn't grow forever. They've closed hundreds of stores in this past year, and they're going to close hundreds more. So you can't really calculate what you want to do with your life based on the near-term estimates of what a given industry is going to do. You have to figure out how in the world you can act on the things that you love. Not very practical.
But good advice.
Yes, thank you.
I have a friend and buddy on Martha's Vineyard named John Abrams, and he runs a little company called South Mountain. It's 40 people. It's actually an interesting thing because everyone owns the company. Everyone has a share. But here's one of John's core principles. He says, we challenge the gospel of growth. We do not grow our company beyond the volume that we set unless we consciously agree to grow. And that's the standing principle of South Mountain Company, to challenge the gospel of growth. Do you have a comment back to him, or you want to move on?
No, that was good, thanks. So you're
Okay.
kind of thinking we should settle more into like a niche market, like settle into a specific kind of tourism or smaller hotels or things like that? Okay, thanks.
Who's next? You can jump in here, Dan, whenever you feel like you want to. Are you kind of this cabal here?
Well,
Okay.
Let me make one comment to the woman here about when I go around to communities and I do focus groups on tourism, the people who are hardly ever at the table are the tourism industry. You know what I mean? The folks who show up are the ones who care about their place. They're the people who work for the Historical Society. They're the old guard, what we call the good old boys who, are on the city council and whatnot. And here we are doing tourism programs, but the hoteliers, who are often not of the place, there's it's a tremendously transient industry, as you all know, the turnover. And my suggestion would be to imagine yourself as a citizen of that community, not as a hotel person, but as somebody who cares about that place. It's in your own best interest as a hotel person to be involved, but to be a responsible corporate citizen and show up and contribute. Not so much for what it does to your hotel, but what it does for your community. So, all I can say is be involved, Don't just think of your job as designing hotel spreadsheets and, you know, organizational charts and marketing tools. But how can you, this is the whole premise of civic tourism, how can you as a tourism professional use your skills, right, and your very important contribution to that community to make that place better for the people who live there, not just for the folks you're trying to get to come to your community. So that's my 2 cents.
You're up.
Thanks. Dan was in our group too, so this is his question.
I think he asked you to ask him this question.
Yeah, well, we're blaming him for it a little bit, yeah. My name is Ethan Ken. I'm with Project for Public Spaces in New York. Our sort of thought/question is, how do we take this crisis and look at it as an opportunity to help people appreciate and value in a way many of the shared assets that we do have. While there's a financial crisis, a lot of the shared destinations, the shared experiences that we have that make up many of our tourist destinations, at home and away. How do we use this to help appreciate those things more, help people realize the value of those things, invest in them further, and then also bring new partners that maybe haven't gotten these ideas of the value of these, bring new partners to the table to help invest in them and preserve the value of these things and grow new visions, grow a new society that is more sustainable and dynamic and resilient over time.
Well, again, I may be too hopeful, but I'm not usually accused of being too hopeful. You probably gathered that from the talk. But I do hope that one of the consequences of the hardships that we're in store for, economic and ecological and political hardships that we're in store for, is going to make people appreciate more how much we depend on one another, and therefore how much our shared wealth, schools, parks, museums, I don't need to tell you, you work in that, but how much our shared wealth is in fact the true fundamental source of our well-being, and that's everything from the air to the airwaves to the judicial system, as opposed to our personally held wealth. Personally held wealth is important, but we have so distorted our culture in the pursuit of personally controlled wealth while neglecting our shared wealth, allowing our infrastructure, I mean, I said all this in the talk, our infrastructure to run down, our schools to deteriorate, our parks to be underfunded, while allowing all that shared wealth to deteriorate while we're buying bigger and bigger screens and bigger houses and bigger vehicles for our own private use. The alternative is not between putting all our resources and effort and value in the public realm or putting it all in the private realm. It's to have some balance between the two. And right now, and in recent decades in America, the balance between the pursuit of private wealth and the regard for public wealth, shared wealth, has been completely out of balance. And one of the effects of hard times, and this happened in the Depression, it's happened in wartime, hasn't happened in this wartime because we've not been asked to make any sacrifices for this wartime. Zero. But one of the effects of hard times is that people look up from their little private enterprises and their little obsession with their own, what's to their personal advantage, and think, well, I need my neighbors, you know, I need a good town to live in, my kids need good schools to go to, I need a good society to live in. So one of my hopes, paradoxically, is that hardship may make us spontaneously care more about the public realm. There was a possibility of that happening right after 9/11. If you remember back to the weeks right after 9/11, the immediate generalized public response to that was not let's go kill people. It was kindness. People were really amazingly kind and considerate to one another. There was a sense of that our skin had been stripped away and our nerves were exposed, and we remembered why we live in communities, because we need one another, and we enjoy one another's company, and also we enjoy the glories that are only possible because people come together and make them, whether it's a church or a tourism council or a museum or government for that matter. We need one another, we value one another, and we reground our lives in that shared world. Now, that's not a program, what I'm describing. It's a hope for and a hunch about a kind of emotional reorientation. We also need voices. We need voices of people. 24 hours a day, we hear voices on television, on radio, and on billboards, and on every form of advertising saying, you are the center of the universe. Your comfort, your status, your pleasure, your sexiness, your whatever is all that matters. We're inundated with that. Where do we hear voices saying, you know, actually, the world that we share is really what matters. And only if we take care of the world that we share is what we own privately going to be of any worth. We need more voices in every format. Speakers, writers, journalists, teachers, ministers, rabbis. We need more voices reminding us that the commonwealth is vital to our well-being.
Okay.
Well, one quick thought is that I think there's a real opportunity for the tourism industry to take a leadership role on this and look at these, because there isn't actually another industry that's really looking at the shared public realm in this more creative, multidisciplinary way that can bring the many different partners to the table and really manage our shared. No one's managing our shared public assets in this way and looking at them in a creative sort of on long-term way.
That's you just said it right there. That's the point, guys. Think about it. What other industry crosses over all the things that Scott was talking about more than tourism? What other industry benefits from healthy communities, healthy environments more than tourism? And what other industry is disadvantaged more by crappy environments? If you go in and the place is polluted, the river's dirty, the air is unclean, the water's not good, it's not a good tourist experience. Right? What other industry is disadvantaged more by just crap development? Tourists don't travel to sprawl. That's not what they're looking for. They're looking for unique, authentic, historic, pedestrian-friendly, places. They're looking for places. This is why, it gets back to her question about what do you do as tourism professionals. When you go to the legislature and you lobby for tourism, and a lot of us have done this, who's there? It's the industry, right? Why isn't there somebody helping to get money for tourism who represents the parks? Right? And vice versa. I mean, that's my big, hobby horse, is when you're trying to save that mountain out there, why isn't there somebody from the tourism business shoulder to shoulder with the environmentalists? It's in their best interest to save that place, right? Not just to go down and lobby for the rental car companies and the airline industries and the usual tourism suspects. But this is, what we're trying to get the industry to think about is that you're not this little boutique thing selling rubber tomahawks, that you're an important contributor to the quality of the place for the people who live there and ultimately for your own bottom line. But you said it perfectly, is that the tourism industry, and we can argue about whether there even is a tourism industry and who comprises it, but what we typically think of the tourism industry in our communities has to think of itself as something other than just heads and beds and being a responsible corporate citizen, as I said a while ago. And all the issues that, whether peak oil has happened yet, we all know it's happening. It's going to come, and things are not going to be easier for travel. And so I absolutely buy into the whole thing about local travel and seeing as an opportunity, and have the industry be the leader, have the industry really be the voice that stands up and says, we can be the force, we can be one of the guiding lights to help us create these kind of places that are livable. Sorry.
Okay, so this isn't our conversation, but so I've been thinking, one of the drivers of our economy right now, at least in the Northeast, are meds and eds, right? Higher education and healthcare. Higher education brings extraordinary amount of creative energy that brings a lot of tourism to local communities, but it's probably also one of the greatest destroyers of place. So I'm wondering, being in higher ed, your relationship to that, and how there can be a conversation within higher ed in particular about its responsibility to place and what its connection is back to the issues that we're talking about today.
I'm not at all disputing your point, but could you say a little more about how it destroys place? Or
By ripping down communities.
okay, just the sprawl of the campuses and so forth.
Just completely destroying neighborhoods.
Yeah, there's another sense. I've taught at Indiana University my whole career, which is now 38 years. I've also been a visitor at many other universities, including a year at MIT, so I spent a year in Boston. But there's another way in which universities, in particular, higher education, are disconnected from their place. If you go, I would wager this, if you go to the major universities in New England, and of course some of the world's greatest universities are here, you would find very, very few people on the faculty who are paying any attention to New England. Probably, you know, the world's greatest authority on the folk music of the Maori people of New Zealand may be there. There will be a handful of folks, maybe you study folklore or anthropology or archaeology of New England, but for the most part they're not really interested in where they are. They live in, I'm talking about academics, and especially high-powered research academics, live in a community which is not related physically or geographically or even historically to where they actually live. They work in a community which is transnational and which is related to their intellectual specialty. So that's another way in which, not all, there are wonderful exceptions, but many faculty members, it's true at my university and it's true at others that I visited, really have no inherent interest in where they are. And are only, in many cases, think of themselves as there temporarily. I had a colleague in Indiana who retired a couple of years ago, who was there, he was hired the same year I was, and after 35 years retired, and he never actually admitted that that's where he was working. He always would say, well, I'm going to be here a little while and then I'm going to move on. There's that kind of gypsy quality to a lot of academics. So what's the solution to that? One solution, I think, is for students at campuses to be encouraged to pay attention to where they are. They're there temporarily, typically 4 years. It's a temporary time, but still 4 years is a long time. And so on our campus, for example, we have courses available, but we also have programs available to help students become acquainted with, they don't learn it in depth, but become acquainted with the human and natural history of where they are. And what have people done for a living there, for example? What are the wild creatures that live there? How has the land been shaped and so on? That's not a university-wide effort. That is, many students go through 4 years of there and could have been anywhere else on the planet for all the attention they pay to the location. It helps to have university administrators who believe that their place, that the university and its faculty and its students should be knowledgeable about and contribute to the culture of the place where they actually are located. If you have a president or a provost or a dean who has that attitude, that can have a tremendous effect. Otherwise, you just have a scattering of faculty members and a scattering of students who actually care about where they're located. One thing about meds, I mentioned that Americans already spend, the next closest to us in terms of per capita expenditure on healthcare is Germany, and they spend 50% as much per capita as we do. And they have better health outcomes. In fact, Cuba has better health statistics than we do, the nation of Cuba. And despite the fact that we spend enormous amounts, more than any other country, on healthcare, we don't have especially good outcomes. The very rich get along fine, but you look at anything, infant mortality rate, diabetes, on and on. We don't have very good health outcomes, especially given what we spend. So every state practically in the country that I have spent time in has seen its future, one of its main future economic sources is healthcare. But think about it for a moment. The epidemic of cancer, for example, the side effects of obesity, these are not blessings. These are draining resources, intellectual resources, financial resources, geographical resources from more productive things. Mind you, I think people who need medical care ought to get it, but we shouldn't celebrate the fact that Americans need so much and such expensive health care. We should take that actually as a national, as a threat to our security. It's projected that by the year 2025, Americans collectively will spend 25% of our total income on health care. And the nearest other country will spend on the order of 5 or 7%. So there's something fundamentally wrong with how we fund medical care in this country. There's also something fundamentally wrong about the average health of Americans, how we eat, how we use our bodies, the fact that we don't use our bodies all that much. So there are problems with eds, you're perfectly right. There are also real problems with meds. It's not a blessing that we have to spend so much of our energy and time and careers. I mean, all these people who spend their careers, very bright, talented people, coping with problems, many of which are caused by the way we lead our lives.
So how do we provoke a conversation within those institutions? Is sort of the vision of university as shopping mall where, we just keep adding more amenities on campus in order to contain our students, but yet are also completely dependent upon having a wonderful place surrounding them to be attractive to students. So students as tourists, I mean, how does that conversation get provoked? How do people like you help to provoke that conversation within the places that you work? In the same conversation in question back to the tourism industry about its own responsibility.
First of all, I agree wholly with your point and your implied judgment that turning universities and colleges essentially into spas, right? Seeing students as customers, and that's a fairly frequently used term now, students as customers. It seems to me utterly out of keeping with my understanding of what education is about. And also my sense that higher education is a privilege. It's a rare privilege on this planet. Maybe pretty common in America, but it's a rare privilege on this planet. So I agree with that view that more and more of universities' resources are being, and I don't get too far away from tourism because this might be too specialized a conversation, I apologize. That more and more universities are putting more and more resources essentially into turning the campuses into country clubs. In the living arrangements, in the recreational facilities, in internet, wireless internet everywhere, and less of their resources into what they're supposed to be doing, which is providing the best possible education and research facilities that they can provide. How can the conversation be nurtured? One of the ways I think would be to get city government more involved in discussions with the universities and colleges about the impact they're having on they're money cows, for one thing. They're a source of revenue for cities and towns, all these students who are brought through with their charge cards. On the other hand, they cost the cities and towns a lot to cope with transients and so forth. I think getting city government more involved with university administrations. I think maybe getting local historical societies to talk with the people in the history departments, local people who are involved in local culture, music, theater, and so forth, off campus, and getting involved with conversations, people doing similar things on campus. Some of that goes on, of course, but more of it should go on. So I don't have a recipe, I'm afraid.
You have one? I want to find out how many more questions there are. Just yours? So you have one over there? Okay. Okay. So you're going to have the last question.
Actually more of a response, which is that it's not a solution or a recipe either, but actually this is starting to happen, at least in Rhode Island. through VISTA, the Volunteers in Service to America organization, they've created the Rhode Island Campus Compact. And Rhode Island's higher education has teamed up, and they are putting students out in civic engagement opportunities. They are working, for example, at Roger Williams University. The kids who are in the history department are working directly with the community organizations trying to preserve our historic jewels in the state. And they will be involved in that as volunteers. And so that's maybe somebody who we need to have more at the table, is a group like that, because they're already kind of doing it. Of course, the follow-up question, and I hate to end on a gloomy note, is that that's funded through our government system by and large, and as those funds dry up, we're going to have to try to figure out other ways to reach out from a local level to get those students there. So.
Yeah, and thanks for your good comment, because it reminds me, and this is only a slight variation on what she's just said very well, and that is many universities, including my university, have put a tremendous emphasis on what's called service learning, which means incorporating into courses a requirement that students work in some volunteer setting within the community, which is great for the students, it's great for the organizations that they serve, and it's really good for the university because it keeps bringing back into the university a richer awareness of really what life is like out there. So service learning is a variation on what she was just talking about, and that is a national movement, and it's one of the most encouraging movements I've seen in recent years.
So should we thank Scott and Dan? Thank you. There's food and drink there. There'll be music here in a little bit. I want to point out 3 documents you might want to pick up on your way out. One is, looks like this. It's an elaborated program beyond the one that's like this. Okay, it's sort of a companion to this. And you'll need this to know where to go for the various workshops, what restaurants to show up for the cafe conversations and workshops tomorrow, the different times that the labs are starting, and the whole 9 yards. So you need this document. Second is a little cheat sheet on the 5 labs. It's on the table out there. So if you haven't made a choice on a lab, or you can make a different choice. Oh, I didn't know they were going to do that in Newport. I want to go there instead. So you can take a look at this and make a lab choice. And the last document is something called Participant Guidance for the Civic Lab Experience, which is basically your little cheat sheet, you know, how you as a participant should engage in this laboratory. That's out there as well. There'll be some more handouts tomorrow. Once the labs are filled, you'll each get a little briefing package. So the Newport folks have a briefing package, the Providence folks, the Mystic folks, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know where we're going to be tomorrow? Woonsocket. My French-Canadian part. Woonsocket. So, food, music, and drink. Thank you.